There were no marks to be had in Strasbourg. The mounting exchange had cleaned the bankers out days ago, so we changed some French money in the railway station at Kehl. For 10 francs, I received 670 marks. 10 francs amounted to about 90 cents in Canadian money. That 90 cents lasted Mrs. Hemingway and me for a day of heavy spending, and at the end of the day, we had 120 marks left. Our first purchase was from a fruit stand beside the main street of Kehl, where an old woman was selling apples, peaches, and plums. We picked out 5 very good-looking apples and gave the old woman a 50-mark note. She gave us back 38 marks and change. A very nice-looking, white-bearded old gentleman saw us buy the apples and raised his hat. "Pardon me, sir," he said, rather timidly in German. "How much were the apples?" I counted the change and told him 12 marks. He smiled and shook his head. "I can't pay it. It's too much." He went up the street walking very much as white-bearded old gentlemen of the old regime walk in all countries, but he had looked very longingly at the apples. I wish I had offered him some. 12 marks on that day amounted to a little under 2 cents. The old man, whose life savings were probably, as most of the non-profiteer classes are, invested in German pre-war and war bonds, could not afford a 12-mark expenditure. He's the type of the people whose incomes do not increase with the falling purchasing value of the mark and the krona. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria. And this week, we're going to take a little look at what Hayek has to say about the legalized drug we don't spend enough time talking about, inflation. So what I just read there was Ernest Hemingway's description of inflation in Germany in 1922. As Jeffrey Frieden writes in Global Capitalism, after the First World War, inflation got out of control all over Europe. Some countries, such as Greece or Finland or Romania, were fortunate enough to see only an 85 to 99% loss in the value of their currency. But in countries like Austria and Hungary, for example, prices shot up 14,000-fold and 23,000-fold, respectively. If you move over to Poland, prices went up by 2.5 million times what they were initially. In Russia, 4 billion times. And of course, if we come to the famous example, Germany, in late 1923, prices had shot up 1 trillion times what they were at the outset. Things have become so extreme and dire that whether you got paid in the morning or the afternoon was practically a life or death issue. Thankfully, we're a long ways away from that problem, or so it appears at least. It's a vivid example of just how destructive extreme levels of inflation can be. But if anything, inflation is the furthest thing from people's concerns today. I mean, we've seen some price fluctuations in line with lockdown supply and demand. For example, airplane tickets and hotel rooms are cheaper, and pajamas are a little pricier. But I should register here a couple of caveats. For one, consumer goods prices are not the only ones to watch out for. There's also the prices of assets, real estate, stocks, bonds, which have been going up in the past decades. And secondly, inflation traditionally referred not to price increases, but to an increase in the quantity of money in the economy, which could cause a price increase as a consequence, but doesn't have to. In fact, Hayek disavowed the notion of cost-push inflation. In other words, the idea that a price increase in one sector, the price of oil, say, would raise aggregate prices. He stated that neither higher wages nor higher prices of oil or imports can drive up the aggregate price of all goods unless the purchasers are given more money to buy them. In other words, are interest rates low? Are banks printing lots of money? But Hayek has some other general concerns with inflation that are worth considering here. So I'd like to go through them. The prevailing wisdom in discussing inflation is that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. This is what's known as the Phillips curve. The idea here is that there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. What that means is that a lower unemployment rate, for example, means more people are working. This means labor is in greater demand. Now, if labor is in greater demand, then that can increase the price of labor, and in other words, wages. And if companies have to pay their staff higher wages, then they might try to make up for that expenditure by raising the prices of their products. Now, the Phillips curve is an old theory whose validity has been called into question on several occasions, today, for example, and of course, most notably during the 1970s when we saw stagflation. So in other words, high rates of unemployment along with high rates of inflation. Whether the Phillips curve was ever really valid to begin with is not the question here. What is relevant is the fact that governments, many economists, and many other people believe it to express a real relation. And so if you're faced with a choice between higher unemployment or higher inflation, you'll happily settle for the latter. After all, the political pressure to do so will be enormous. This has led to the idea that deflation is much worse than inflation, and so it's better to err on the side of caution and tend towards inflation. But you could argue from a long-term point of view that inflation is much more dangerous. Indeed, this is precisely what Hayek does. Because of the two errors, inflation is the error that's more likely to be committed. Hayek says here, the reason for this is that moderate inflation is generally pleasant while it proceeds, whereas deflation is immediately and acutely painful. There's little need to take precautions against any practice, the bad effects of which will be immediately and strongly felt. But there is need for precautions wherever action which is immediately pleasant or relieves temporary difficulties involves much greater harm that will be felt only later. There is indeed more than a mere superficial similarity between inflation and drug taking, a comparison which has often been made. But Hayek goes on to say that inflation and deflation are disappointing twice over, though. What does he mean by this? Well, he says the first time it's disappointing is when prices are higher or lower than expected. But the second time is when these changes are expected and thus cease to have the effect which their unforeseen occurrence had. Because as soon as people start to expect inflation, then it must continue at an increased rate in order to maintain the same degree of prosperity. We're then committed to either more inflation or paying for it with a recession. This makes business planning very difficult, if not impossible. It also makes it more and more difficult for people of moderate means to provide for their old age themselves. Inflation discourages saving and encourages running into debt. In the process, it also destroys the middle class. And in so doing, it creates a dangerous gap between the propertyless and the wealthy, which is a characteristic of prolonged periods of inflation. Inflation is so tempting because it's the easy way out of temporary difficulties. It therefore has a destructive psychological effect as well. It encourages short-run thinking, a disregard of the long term, and an exclusive concern with immediate advantages. So, how does one deal with the instability caused by inflation? Well, the ideal scenario that many policymakers hope for is to be able to ensure maximum employment and a monetary policy that keeps the currency stable. But there are a couple of other solutions worth thinking about. One is the gold standard, and the other, which Hayek was a major advocate of in the 1970s, is the denationalization of money. We'll take a look at both of those in future videos. And that's what Hayek would say. This guy is awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I hope you've really been enjoying our videos. If you have, and if you'd like to hear what Hayek has to say about something else, anything, then let me know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.